Everything good on the mics? Great.
Hello, everyone. We're getting ready for Havdalah here, so I hope everyone can hear me properly. Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Let me hook up the mic and we'll let you
All right, in just a moment we'll begin Havdalah. I made these nice little source sheets for Havdalah, which you can take home. This is awesome. Nice setup. Yeah. Okay. They're rabbi-proof. Sure. Hine el Yeshuati Evtach velo efchad Ki ozi v'zimratya Adonai vayhili lishua Ushavtem mayim v'sason Mimaynei ha-Yeshua Adonai ha-Yeshua Alamcha birchatecha selah Adonai tzvot imanu Mizkav lanu Elohei Yaakov selah Adonai tzvot Ashrei Adam boteach bach Adonai Hoshia Hamelech Yaneinu Beyom Koreinu LaYudim Hayta Ora Besimcha V'sason Vikar Kein Tia Lanu Kol Tishuot Esah Uveshem Adonai Ekram Yainai-nai-nai, yainai-nai Yainai-nai-nai, yainai-nai Yainai-nai-nai, yainai-nai Yainai-nai-nai, yainai-nai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei peri hagafen Yananai-nai, yananai-nai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei minei v'samim Yananai-nai, yananai-nai Yananai-nai, yananai-nai Yananai-nai, yananai-nai Yananai-nai, yananai-nai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei meorei ha'esh Yananai-nai, yananai-nai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Hamavdil bein kodesh lechol Bein or lechoshech Bein Yisrael amim Bein yom hashevi L'sheshet yemei ha'maseh L'sheshet yemei ha'maseh Baruch atah Adonai Hamavdil bein kodesh lechol Yananai-nai, yananai-nai Yananai-nai Shavua tov Yananai-nai, yananai-nai Yananai-nai, yananai-nai Yananai-nai, yananai-nai Hamavdil ben kodesh lechol Chatoteinu yimchu Zareinu b'chasbeinu Yarvei arbekacho Echako pavim balayla Zareinu b'chasbeinu Yarvei arbekacho Echako pavim balayla Shavua tov, Shavua tov Shavua tov, Shavua tov, Shavua tov, Shavua Tov, Shavua Tov, Shavua Tov. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Agiladi, B'meira Yameinu, Yavo Eleinu, Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben David, Miriam HaNeviah, Oz v'Zimra beyada, Miriam tirkoditanu, lehagdil Zimrat olam, Miriam tirkoditanu, letakein et haolam. B'meira v'yameinu, hitevienu, El Mei HaYeshua, El Mei HaYeshua.
Yashikoach, Rabbi. All right, so tonight we're here for the third discussion with Dr. Arnold Eisen from Chancellor Emeritus from the JTS. Tonight's lecture title is Engagement, a Part and a Part. So welcome everyone. A few key items. First of all, I want to thank all of our benefactors and sponsors that can be found in our program book. It's with their donations that we're allowed to put on these really exciting programs. So thank you very much for that. We've already heard two introductions, so this one's going to be very brief. Dr. Eisen accomplished a lot in his life. Was Chancellor Emeritus, is now Chancellor Emeritus at JTS. He went to a lot of schools and learned a lot. He's written a bunch of books, and he's married to Adrienne Levine and has 2 children. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Eisen. And one important thing for those out in Zoom land, if you have a question, put it in the chat and I will convey that to Dr. Eisen. Okay? Thank you.
That's one of the best introductions I've ever had. I've had lots of introductions. My favorite was the person who said, "And now for a man who deserves no introduction." So this is the opposite of a lecture, and I'm imagining that we are in a living room, like some of the people who are watching us on Zoom may be, and we're sitting around in a living room, and we're ready to have a frank, personal conversation about the issues that we've been engaged with here, about our personal relationship with Israel, what we have experienced, what we wish we had experienced, what we'd like to experience in the future. We can do sociology, as I call it, as an aid to this. In other words, doing sociology means you talk about Jews in general, other people, other Jews or non-Jews. But the heart of the discussion should be more personal. So I'm going to introduce it by just saying a couple things that I haven't shared yet. And then I'm really going to throw the floor open. And we're going to, Andy assures me that this is a wireless mic, so
Unfortunately, that's not going to work with Zoom.
so it's not going to work. So if people in the room want to speak, what will they do?
You'll graciously repeat the question.
So, well, but this is going to be harder because it's not going to be a question, it's going to be a statement. So we could have them come up here. Would that be too disruptive? Let's do that. So, okay, anybody who's shy, if I have any power to order you, you're not allowed to be shy for the next hour, right? You have to be willing to come up here. I will vacate the premises for COVID reasons. I'll go far away. And just come up here and share the mic and speak in your imagination. We're in that living room. So I want to begin with one of the greatest historians of the Jews of the 20th century. Was an Israeli, you probably heard of, named Gershom Scholem. He was the person who opened up the field of Jewish mysticism. And if today you are studying Hasidism or Zohar, or there's a translation of the Zohar into English, this whole renaissance of interest in Kabbalah is really because Scholem opened up this field. But Scholem was also a keen observer of the Jewish world, and I take Scholem very seriously because he was brilliant and he was one of the greatest and most committed Jewish scholars ever. And Scholem believed the American diaspora was doomed. He believed that we had no future. His own biography was that he left Germany when his entire family stayed, and he survived and they didn't. So Scholem, though, concludes an essay called Israel and Diaspora, which he wrote in 1969, with this line: "It is the personal factor in this mutual concern that will be decisive when all is said and done, whether each and every one of us will discover the unity in our difference, the our being Jewish." So I am convinced by this, and this is not a statement you can make as a historian or a sociologist. This is speculation. This is a matter of faith. But I, as a person who obviously believes in institutions, since I led one for 14 years, and I do not doubt the importance of AIPAC and Federation and everything else that we have going for us, I believe that at the end of the day, the future of Israel-diaspora relations depends on individual decisions by Jews living in Israel and Jews living in the diaspora, that it's important for them to relate to one another. Organizations are not going to do it. Hundreds of thousands of individual decisions are going to do it. So that's one of the reasons why I was so excited when I was asked to speak about this particular topic here and to learn that you're devoting a year to talking about this. So I'm now here to help. I'm here to help you think about this. And so I'm hoping that the previous couple of talks will open up something, a conversation that we can have with one another, and I'll periodically interject something to further the discussion along, but I'm hoping that the heart of the matter will be what you contribute to the evening. The second thing I want to do is mention this piece I wrote, and unfortunately it's not digitized. I wrote a piece in 1984 called "To Keep the Blessing, Why I Am Making Aliyah." People joked to me when my wife and I left 2 years later, am I making an article called "Why I Am Making Yeridah," but I didn't write that article because I still believe in the project, and we left, as I said, for personal reasons, financial and family, not because of any disappointment with Israel or any ideological differences. But I just wanted to summarize a part of my thinking that I hadn't really spoken about yet. So I did mention earlier today, for those of you who are here this afternoon or on the live stream, that I have been profoundly influenced by the book of Deuteronomy. When we left our apartment in Manhattan and moved to Riverdale, I found boxes of papers I had not seen in a long time. And in these boxes, I found an essay that I wrote in 1975, which is the age of 24, a 90-page essay I wrote for myself, really, about the book of Deuteronomy. Because I was so moved by it. And if people say to me, give me in one sentence why you made Aliyah, the answer would be because of the book of Deuteronomy. Because it seized my imagination with the notion that Jews could actually live in a time and space where they controlled, for the most part, what they see every day, where the surroundings supported your view of the world and your values and not somebody else's values. where not only could you have a Jewish institution inside the walls of a synagogue or inside the walls of a school, but you would have to make foreign policy and healthcare policy and educational policy and the treatment of minorities, etc., based on Jewish principles, and you spend your time fighting, of course, arguing about what those Jewish principles are, because Jews are not going to agree, never have been, never will, but that discussion was going to be the heart of the matter, and I would rather, I said to myself at the age of 24, when I wrote that piece, or at the age of, how old was I when we made Aliyah? 1984, I was 33. I'd rather have that discussion than be an observer on the side who feels allowed and compelled to criticize the decisions that someone else is making, but for which I will never be responsible, because the Jewish community in the United States is never going to be more than it is right now, which is about 2%, 2.25%. We lose percentages all the time. So we're never going to be dominant in this country. And we have influence in politics that's way beyond our numbers. And we're so overrepresented in Congress, right? And in the White House, etc. So this is a community of enormous achievement, and that's not coincidence. Again, you can't prove these things, but it's one of my beliefs that we are running so fast, we are trying to achieve and overachieve as individuals and as a community because of Jewish history, and we're hoping that our achievement will enable us to outrun anti-Semitism. I can't prove that to you, but I believe that that's true. So I think the Holocaust continues to drive a lot of what Jews do consciously and subconsciously in Israel and in the United States and elsewhere. But in Israel, I thought I had the chance to be part of a majority, to walk down the street and hear Hebrew spoken on the street, to see Jewish images and not non-Jewish images. Now, when I say this, I'm going to share what's in my head because I'm already going to have some irony about what I just said. We used to live in a neighborhood of Jerusalem called Talpiot, and I used to wait for the number 7 bus, and there was a bus shelter there. But when somebody put up an advertisement for swimsuits in that bus shelter that was particularly revealing, Haredim burned down the bus shelter, and as a result, I got wet waiting for the bus. That is a concrete example of how your life in Israel is determined by other Jews, not always for the best. I didn't like the swimsuit ad either. I thought it was offensive. I would not have wanted my kids to see that particular ad, and there it was in the bus shelter, but I wouldn't have burned it down. So getting wet while waiting for the bus was the consequence there of living in a society with a Jewish majority where some Jews took it into their own hands, that the image that they want to see has to be a Jewish image, and they weren't going to see this modern Western image of a woman. They were going to burn down the bus shelter. So for me, that is still the heart of the matter where Israel is concerned, and that is what's hard for Israelis to understand. And I had breakfast this week with a former student of mine, a former undergraduate student who just got married, and he and his wife are making Aliyah this week. And they could not understand why all of us are not doing what they're doing. They could not understand why one would possibly want to be a part of a minority instead of being part of a majority. Because your influence, they thought, is so much less, and the stake in the Jewish future is so much less if you're here. So I have Deuteronomy, and that's my introduction to you. So if you had to say in a sentence, what is the image or idea or conviction or fear that motivates you to be connected to Israel in the way that you are and not in a different way, what is that sentence? Did you ever think of moving there and decide not to? Did you ever move there like I did and come back? Where are you on this whole set of questions? And what we need are some nachshons who are going to step into the water and initiate this discussion, because it's always true that after 2 or 3 people speak, it'll be much easier for everybody else. So I'm going to move. How about if I move down there? I'll move down there, and I'm inviting someone to come up here, and if no one has anything to say, we can all go home. But let's not do that. It's not nice outside. Let's have a good conversation.
Repeat the question. You want people to...
Repeat the question. Where are you on the issue of engaging Israel? If someone asked you to do what I just did and say, summarize in a sentence or a phrase or an idea a reason why you have the relationship to Israel that you do. Do you feel close to Israel? Did you used to feel closer? Does government policy disturb you? Does anti-Semitism make you think that maybe you should be there? Et cetera, et cetera. This whole set of, there's no one question, but I somehow want everybody to get into the issue in a personal way, which I think is the point of this year-long engagement of Israel that you're having in the congregation. And this is what the Hartman Institute curriculum that the rabbi's introducing wants to do, engaging Israel, getting, and I believe, as I said at the beginning, that this may sound pretentious, but I try not to be pretentious. I'm using the authority of Gershom Scholem here. I really do believe that these conversations on this level among Jews, this is what is going to determine the future relationship with Israel. Not the Federation and not AIPAC, but how individual Jews like us make the decisions that we do. I think this kind of conversation is urgently important. And I wish we could have them on the Israeli side too, and one of the things we're going to talk about tomorrow is how maybe we can encourage the Israelis to have these kinds of conversations as well. All right, I think that's enough of an introduction. I think I will stop, and the podium is available to anyone who is willing to come up and use it. And you're monitoring, if you have people at home who want to contribute, you will transmit their contribution. Okay.
Anyone want to come up? Deborah? Thank you.
So I grew up in the youth movement, Young Judea. It's where I learned to be Jewish. It's where I learned to understand, having grown up in a Jewish home that wasn't particularly observant in any way. Going to camp was really my first exposure to Shabbat, kashrut, any kind of knowledge and education. And I went to, with the Young Judea program, I went to Israel for the summer when I was after 10th grade, and I went to Israel for the year between high school and college. Finished college, moved home for the year, and got to thinking, what do I want with my life? And I remember really considering moving to Israel at that time. And I ran into the rabbi of the local conservative synagogue, who eventually married Gary and me, and I said, how do you make that decision? How do you determine whether you should move to Israel or stay here? And his response was really a very informed response. He said, you pick your problems. Each place has problems. You stay here, there are things you face as a Jew. You go to Israel, there are things you face as a Jew, as a citizen. Had I been with somebody at the time, going to marry somebody who was going to move to Israel, maybe I would have, but I wasn't going by myself. My family was here, my education was here. I speak some Hebrew, but I certainly wasn't fluent, and so I made that decision to stay here. But I think Israel is central to Jews and to Jewish life. And I feel very strongly about it. And it doesn't matter that I don't necessarily agree with all the politics, and it doesn't matter that I necessarily agree with any of the religious influence that the Haredim have. It's Israel, and it's ours. And I think it's important for us to support it and visit as often as possible. So.
Have you regretted the decision? Can you repeat the question?
I was asked whether I regret the decision. No, I have a wonderful life here. I think I could have had a wonderful life there too. But I don't live with regrets. So no, would I have liked to have lived in Israel? I think I would have. But I'm happy here too. So, and as most of you know, I work within the Jewish community. So I think I have met part of my needs to be involved with community through my vocation as well. which, is rewarding for me. I feel privileged to be in my position at Federation. So.
So it happens that I know some of the people that Debbie knows from Young Judea. I'm married to one of them. And Debbie, they told me that your friend Alan Schwartz, they sang this song, "Goodbye America and Goodbye Inflation, we'll move to Israel and save the Jewish nation." Exactly. Now I'm going to use it, I want to make a more serious point out of that there's always a push and a pull where Aliyah is concerned. And the reason why it's generally thought the Aliyah from the United States is much lower than the Aliyah from England or France or Latin America is because the push is less. That is, until recently anyway, the level of anti-Semitism was low, and it's still low compared to any place else in the world, and so there's less of a push. So there, the "Goodbye America, Goodbye Inflation," but that was a joke. There was really a pull. So when I described the book of Deuteronomy and my Aliyah, it was a dream. And the question is, does Israel still exercise this pull? And for Haredi Jews, for Orthodox Jews, the pull is stronger than ever before. For a lot of non-Orthodox Jews, the pull is weaker than before because it's perceived that Israel is not open to that kind of Judaism. So there are a lot of young Jews I know, I've asked, I say, so did you think about Aliyah? Well, yeah, but they don't want us there. Right? Other Jews go because you say, well, they need us there. But there's always this notion of a pull and a push, and I'm glad you talked about the personal. That's what I tried to open up. We make decisions for all sorts of personal reasons, and that's why the ideologists can't win in the end. It's always going to be a matter of personal decisions. How do you imagine your future? What is your connection to your family? I'm an only child. For only children, it's different than for people who have many siblings, etc., etc. So, anyway, these are the realities. And ideology is never as accurate as the realities.
There's a question from Zoom land.
So I stay here?
Well, a comment. Let's see. So this is from Celia Diamond. I have visited, which we hope is doing well, and we miss Celia. I have visited, this is from Celia. I have visited Israel 3 times and have friends and relatives there. I love the land of Israel because of emotional ties and because it is the subject and the site of the rich, beautiful, enigmatic writings, especially the 5 books of Moses and the ethics and spirituality reflected in the prayer book. I would not immigrate to Israel because I also love the United States, and my immediate family and so many friends are here.
So again, I'm going to just interject something in the meantime while the next person thinks about what they want to say. You may have noticed one thing I did not talk about, which was a personal relationship to the land. I never felt it. A lot of people do. Maybe because I'm a city boy. I grew up in Philadelphia. I don't have a romantic relation to the land of Israel. I mean, some of it is beautiful, and the variation of topography within a short distance is remarkable, etc., etc. But there are some people who feel connected to the land. There are people who feel that it's magic. There are people who really want to go there and kiss the earth. For me, this is not the case. You know, there's a dispute in medieval Jewish sources between Maimonides and Nachmanides about the holiness of the land of Israel. Nachmanides, like Rabbi Kook, who I quoted this morning, believe there's an intrinsic holiness to the land. The land is holy itself, is different than other lands. To Maimonides, the land is holy because of holy things that Jews do there. That's my attitude. The holiness of the land is dependent on what we do there. It is not intrinsic to the land itself. Therefore, the onus is on us to do acts of holiness that make it a holy land. And that dispute among medieval philosophers partly figures into contemporary thought. I know Israelis in particular who believe the land is magic. There's something mystical about the land, that this particular piece of earth. And there are certainly West Bank settlers convinced that there is a virtue in having Jews settle the West Bank because it's part of the messianic process that Jews have to do this, or there's just some interrelationship between Jews and this land. So that's another thing that figures. Something you could ask yourself is, if you visited Israel, what was it that got you, or what was it that repelled you? And what was it a relationship to the land? And maybe it's my rational self that I was never particularly stirred by the Western Wall, and I was never particularly stirred by the land. What I love in Israel does not have to do either with the kotel or with the soil. It's this notion of what people are doing there, what we're trying to accomplish there, what I call the project. The project, I'm in love with the project of Israel, not with the land or with the kotel.
There are more questions from people online, but is there somebody here that would like to join in? Bas, okay.
So for me, I hear what other people said. I think it's a lot of convenience to stay in the US. So my wife, Katie, she was born in Israel. Our honeymoon, we went to Israel. I loved it there. It was 16 days. 5 years ago, we went to Israel back to have the kids see Israel. My biggest dream is to just spend 1 year in Israel to see all the holidays, experience that. But I think from convenience perspective, because we live here, the kids go to school here, I would like to have everybody together. I think I would always stay here and not go there, even though I feel very good the few times that I've been there.
Do you feel at home there?
I did not feel not at home, because, especially because my wife is from there, right? There's so much family there. The first time we went, so we arrived, so it was my first time in Israel. Right? We were going to stay with her grandmother, who was in her 80s. And she lived in a religious neighborhood in Ashdod. And the next day we wake up, it's Shabbat morning, and see the people walking through the streets with the Torah, singing, going to a synagogue. Right? That just feels marvelous. The day after, on Sunday, she took us to one of my wife's uncles. Then you get in the bus, I have to sit in the front, they sit in the back, and you go through these gates because they lived on the other side of the Green Line. And it was just a great experience. I didn't feel bad at one moment. I would go there anytime. But I don't think I would move there away from my own family.
All right, let's take one from Zoomland, from Rachel Besser. I went to Israel for the first time at 17 on Ramah seminar. I don't think my parents really gave me a choice. They hadn't gone to Israel until they were married and didn't want that for their kids. I went back for 9 months when Rabbi was at JTS. I had the most wonderful year, learning, traveling, working through a bucket list of museums, cities, and sites. I connected to the land, people, country on a historical level, a spiritual level, and a religious level. Living there greatly impacted my political views. I look forward to going back, especially with my kids. Like Celia, my family is all here, so I would never have considered Aliyah. There is another one on Zoom if you would like me to. Okay. From Gary Reich. A puzzle for me is that some of the people I met in Israel were non-Jews who also feel a pull to Israel and who seek in vain for evidence in their ancestry or even in their genetic makeup for evidence that they may be Jews. Gary, can you expand on that maybe? think it's best via chat. Hold on. I've got to turn on my microphone. Hold on. All right, try speaking now, Gary. It's going to be feedback. Yeah. Gary, you're going to have to type it. I'm sorry. Otherwise, we get a lot of feedback. Is somebody else want to come up? Rabbi, you're going to come up? Maybe while Gary's typing, we'll have Rabbi come up.
The book of Deuteronomy ends with the people not in the land. It's aspirational, which I think you were talking about. This idea of sitting across from the Jordan and imagining what it would be like to create a society that is a Jewish society. The Bereshit begins not in the land. So our Torah starts and ends in exile. And a lot of what happens in the Torah happens in exile. The Bible ends in exile. And I think what you're supposed to take from that, in some sense, is that what it means to be Jewish is to long for something that is unrealized. Like Cubs fans or Red Sox fans who were rooting for so long for their team, but they always lost. And once their team wins the World Series, what it means to be a Cubs fan completely changes. Because it's been realized. Sort of, when I was in rabbinical school, one of my professors talked about what is the difference between thinking of a Pentateuch, like the 5 books of Moses, and a Hexateuch, where some Christian Bibles include the book of Joshua in the books of Moses, right? That is to say, the first 6 books of the Bible are a unit, and then when you read Joshua, and not accidentally, Joshua shares a name with the Redeemer of the Christian faith, Jesus, right? They have the same name. Joshua has an entrance into the land that is about realized dreams. And of course, the book of Joshua is all about how that isn't exactly the way that it doesn't happen the way that we imagine that it would in the book of Deuteronomy. It's a mess. Our greatest literary work as a Jewish people, the Babylonian Talmud, was written in exile, in an exilic community. And so there's a deep part of me that thinks that rabbinic Judaism is a Judaism of longing and not a Judaism of realization. A Judaism that is profoundly at odds with an idea of creating a state in the land. Especially if you think that state is the realization of a messianic dream, as some of the religious Zionists do. Because then you're saying, we've made it. We won the World Series, so to speak, right? It's over. We've been redeemed. And Judaism is about constantly longing for a world which is not yet redeemed, but which we work to redeem. I went to Israel by myself without my parents for the first time when I was 16 on the Alexander Muss High School in Israel program, which is from the Tanakh to the Palmach. Let's gloss over all the parts of Jewish history that happen outside the land and just focus on the land of Israel. And it was a wonderful experience. I'm not knocking my time at Muss, but it does have a particular point of view, that program. And then I spent 10 years not going. And I felt more and more and more distant. And then, like Rachel, who just shared, I lived there while I was in rabbinical school, and it completely changed my sense of connection, and also changed my sense of what it means to be longing for something unrealized, because what exists there is still unrealized. And so to me, right, living in Israel is still about longing for something. It is still consistent with the Jewish idea of longing for something that is unrealized. It's still, like you were saying, Chancellor, it's still about the project of trying to figure out what it means to have a Jewish society. I think that our relationship to Israel is so profoundly important to what it means to be Jewish. From the Tanakh to the Siddur, like as Celia was saying, every piece of it. But I think that we have to spend time there, because when we don't, it's easy to think of ourselves as, okay, well, Shabbat, you don't need Israel for Shabbat. And it's easy to get trapped in this idea that we are essentially an exilic religion that shouldn't go back. I feel like that there's a strong pull of that in our texts, in our sources, and in our American Jewish practice of Judaism. And I think we have to confront that within ourselves in order to move forward in our relationship with Israel. I'm also curious to know what you think about this tension between what it means to be an exilic tradition and moving to the land.
You want to comment? There's several on...
Oh, great. This is working. So the first thing I thought of when you talked about the Red Sox and the Cubs was the quotation from Ben Gurion that I read this afternoon. Ben Gurion said, for those of you who didn't see it or weren't here, that Jews believe in the Messiah because we believe the Messiah is coming, but if the Messiah ever came, the Messiah would not be the Messiah because the Messiah has to always be on the way and not arrived. So you see, that's profound. He got it. He totally got it. He said to wait for the Messiah is to live in hope. And you don't just sit around. Hoping is not sitting there, oh, I wish it. Hoping is working for. So the energy behind what Jews do in the world, which is an amazing amount of stuff, is hoping for the Messiah and trying to bring the Messiah, knowing at some level that the Messiah is not going to come. Now, that might be intolerable for Jews who cast their lives with the state of Israel. So let's play with those ideas for a minute. The ultra-Orthodox rejected Zionism because they say there cannot be a sovereign Jewish state unless the Messiah comes. But Rav Kook, and particularly Rav Kook's son, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, said there can't be a Jewish state unless the Messiah comes, but there is a Jewish state, and therefore the Messiah is coming. And maybe the Messiah is already here because the state is here, and certainly once the state has conquered all of the biblical land of Israel according to one definition of the borders, which stops at the Jordan, then the Messiah is here. Sholem, I'm going to say two more things about Sholem, picking up on your comments. Sholem warned way back in the 1920s that if we were to return the Jewish people to the land of Israel and revive the Hebrew language, it would be like a volcano exploding in Judaism. He said, you could not stop messianic fervor from overtaking the Jews. Because the inner pressure to finally get it done and bring the Messiah would just be too great. And Sholem was afraid of that, because he had written a book about Shabbatai Tzvi. So when apparently half the Jewish world, half the rabbis in the world, became convinced in the 1660s that Shabbatai Tzvi really was the Messiah, and you know that when the Sultan gave Shabbatai Tzvi the choice between converting to Islam or being burned in oil, he chose to convert to Islam, and his followers, many of them believed that he was still the Messiah, but he had to descend to the depths of Islam and raise them up as part of his messianic task, and that's why he converted to Islam. So they didn't give up on him as the Messiah. But Sholem figured that if the Jews ingather from the four corners of the earth and build a sovereign state, and the Messiah doesn't come, the damage would be incalculable. That was his fear. But there was another piece of Sholem, and Sholem wrote an essay which I recommend to you all, called The Messianic Idea in Judaism. And he ends it with the following thought. He said, the belief in the Messiah corresponds to the endless powerlessness the Jews suffered in exile. So we believe in the Messiah because we're powerless. And so, he said, we hang back. But maybe it's time. He didn't come out and say this 100% clearly because it's such a dangerous thought, but this is what I think he was saying. Maybe it's time for a change. We put all our eggs in one basket. Having your eggs in multiple baskets means you have Israel and you have diasporas. So if God forbid something happens to one diaspora, we have the other diasporas, and God forbid something happens to Jews in Israel, we have Jews in the diaspora. And I know Jews who feel that way. I know Jews who say, well, it's important to have American Jewry because we don't want all the Jews in one place. A sideline, when I visited Buenos Aires a few years ago, the head of the Joint Distribution Committee showed me a computer program which listed every Jew in Argentina. And I said, I don't want there to be a computer that lists the name of every Jew in Argentina, because if the anti-Semites got hold of this, it would be horrible. They could hack it and know the address, not just the name, but the address of every Jew in Argentina. There are Jews who don't want every Jew in the land of Israel, because if the Iranians get their way, I won't complete the thought, it's too horrible. But Sholem said, maybe it's time we stop hedging our bets, and let's try it. Let's have every Jew in the world move to Israel and see what happens. Will it bring Messiah or will it not? And that's, in a sense, what you hear from some other Israelis. So the great American rabbi, Arthur Hertzberg, who edited a collection of essays that I quoted from this morning, he gave an introduction to this book on Zionism. It's a classic 50-page introduction to the ideas of Zionism, and it's all about the idea of the Messiah, because Arthur Hertzberg also believed that at bottom, Zionism is a messianic movement. It's a messianic movement. It's not a normal political movement. A normal people does not reclaim a state after 2,000 years. This never happened before. A normal people does not revive a language that had not been spoken for 2,000 years. It's never happened before. And here we have it. So there's a serious argument to be made that we should discard rationality when we talk about Israel, which makes it harder to have this discussion that we're having. But I said at the beginning, this is not an easy discussion to have, because when you're a Jew, you can't think of Israel without thinking in these terms. I have a young Israeli friend who kind of laughs at me when I tell him that the high point of the Kedusha for me is when we say, Mimchomcha malkeinu teofia v'timlocha aleinu ki mechakim anachnu lach. Right? Come on, God, appear already. We're waiting for you. Do it. And of course, that is connected to the land of Israel, to the ingathering of the exiles. And he was making the case that my believing that is destructive of the relationship between Israel and diaspora, because it means that I have a romanticized, idealized vision of Israel, and some Israelis also have this vision, and in order to improve the relationship, both sides have to come down from all this Messiah business and just talk tachlis on real terms. So it's really interesting, this whole discussion, but it's in our thoughts, and I like people coming forward and saying, well, you know, that's all well and good, but I have family, which is why I'm here. I have family here, or I have a life here, and it's a good life here, and I can live as a Jew here, and I have a Jewish community here, and it's good, and I like being there, but I don't have to live there to enjoy this. And there's some Israelis, like Achad Ha'am, you asked me this morning, Boz, what Achad Ha'am meant by a spiritual center. That was in his vision, that Jews from all over the world would come to Israel and buy art by Israeli artists and take it home and put it up in their homes and buy CDs, right? He didn't know, but get the music and bring it home. And so Jewish culture from around the world would come to all of our houses. And ironically, that would enable us to stay where we are. So the great American Jewish thinker Mordechai Kaplan, who taught at JTS for 50 or 60 years and then founded Reconstructionism as a separate movement, Kaplan said the purpose of Zionism is to support Jews living wherever they live. Can you imagine Ben-Gurion was revolted by that idea? What, we're building a state so you can live there in Schenectady? That's the point of all this sacrifice? So you can have a good Jewish life? No way. And that's why when he and Golda came to the United States, they famously said, if you're not living in Israel or not sending your kids to live there, you're not a Zionist. We have no interest in supporting your life there. So there's a sort of a built-in tension. The rabbi just asked me about the tension. There are all these tensions between messianic reality and normal reality, and between us and them. And in order to have the conversation honest, you have to get these tensions out into the open. And now we'll go back to Gary. And let me say to Gary that I'm sorry I don't get to meet you, because it's because of a phone call from Gary that I'm here this weekend.
So there's several Zoomland comments. Maybe I'll read them all, and then maybe you'll comment. And if somebody else wants, from the audience here, wants to say one more thing. So Gary did respond, but let me, to refresh everyone, go to his initial comment. So from Gary Reich, a puzzle for me is that some of the people I met in Israel were non-Jews who also feel a pull to Israel and who seek in vain for evidence in their ancestry or even in their genetic makeup for evidence that they may be Jews. And he continues, I had quite a bit of interaction with non-Jews during the few months I spent in Israel. Some of them felt drawn there, felt they were at home, and took genetic tests in their belief that they must be Jews. There was nothing else about them that seemed odd to me. All right, let's see. Sonia Treviso, I apologize about that, Sonia. I have made 2 trips to Israel, the first one when I was 19 in 1968, when I volunteered on a kibbutz, and the second one 50 years later in 2018. I consider moving to Israel during my first trip, but decided not to because I was idealistic about the life I could have in the U.S. During my second trip, I was so impressed with the vibrancy of the people, especially the youth. They were so friendly and respectful. I was very impressed with how optimistic they seemed about the future. They also were more economically stable than they had been in 1968, which I am sure affected their state of mind. What a contrast to our youth who are so troubled. Our society in the U.S. has declined so much since 1968. In Israel, they have hope for the future, but here we have fear of the future. Now my children and grandchildren are here, so I wouldn't move away from them. But if I was a youth at this time, I think the pull to live there would be much stronger for me than it was in 1968. And from Adrian Klein, I was raised in the Young Israel community in Cleveland back in the 1960s. Many of my teachers were from Teltz Yeshiva. They never mentioned Israel. It was a secular experiment. I left for college, and the left politics I embraced included regarding Israel as a rogue nation. I never was subject to external influence that sought to change that view. Now my view is one of intense curiosity. Like Bas, I am interested in the lived experience of our holidays on the streets of Israel. Questions. In my formative years, Israel was first a non-issue and then regarded as a political pariah. I wonder how common my experience is. Second question. When did American modern Orthodox make the turn from ignoring Israel to embracing it?
This is great. This is intense. This is wonderful. Let me just say to Gary that some of my most intense experiences in Israel also have been with Christians. So I was part of an interfaith group of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And we met in the Sisters of Zion convent. If those of you know it, it was built as a fortress by the Romans. It overlooks the Temple Mount, which is why the fortress was there and why it's now a convent. And in the basement of that convent, you may have done this, there's the actual Via Dolorosa. So the current Via Dolorosa is on the street level, which of course way above where it was 2,000 years ago. But the actual Via Dolorosa, which we know is the actual Via Dolorosa because there are games carved into the stonework that were made by Roman soldiers. So the actual stones that Jesus walked on, you can walk on. So I said to myself, this is meaningful to me, but if I believed that Jesus was the Son of God and that his feet touched this stone and I can touch this stone, that would be amazing. And for a lot of Christian pilgrims, it is amazing. And I met some Christians there, as I've said, and had discussions with them. And what it points up for us is that more than Judaism is at stake in the land of Israel, which is, of course, why we have in Israel. We wouldn't have Israel without the Balfour Declaration. We would not have had the Balfour Declaration except for Christian religious people in England, like Balfour, who believed this was a Holy Land and believed that the return of Jews to the Holy Land was going to help bring Jesus back as the Messiah. And of course, we have all this evangelical support today for the same reason. And the Catholics have built an institute in the Galilee, which overlooks the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus had some action, and they serve Christian pilgrims who come to the Holy Land in that place. And I remember we went there with the JTS group. I had just become chancellor, and they have a Torah scroll, and the priest started giving a sermon on the book of Deuteronomy, and I wanted to shout out, I didn't because I'm polite, but I wanted to shout out, you can't have that, that's ours. But of course they thought it's theirs too, because it's part of their Bible. And the land of Israel is part of their Bible. And it's their holy land. And we didn't have the Son of God walk there, and they did. So it's complicated, and therefore I can relate to Gary's question. The question about Orthodoxy did a turn starting after the Holocaust. Once the Holocaust had happened, and once the state is real, it was folly to say that we shouldn't have a state because they're waiting for the Messiah to come. But then gradually, as I explained earlier today, Orthodoxy in Israel made the move from a non-messianic form of Orthodoxy to a heavily messianic form. It's not all of Orthodoxy, and it's been a little toned down lately. But it's within the last 30 years or so that Orthodoxy revived itself in a big way in the United States, both modern Orthodoxy and Haredi Judaism. And part of the expectation of every modern Orthodox family in America is that their kids are going to go to yeshiva, whether men or women. They're going to go to yeshiva for at least a year and study in Israel, which of course encourages Aliyah. I mean, I did my PhD there, and when I left to take a job in the States, I vowed that I was going to go back on Aliyah, and did. So it gets in your blood, and so it's not surprising that the Aliyah rate for modern Orthodox Jews is much higher, and there's no sign that that's going to lessen in coming years. So I finally want to say that in relationship to what one of the comments was, if conditions for Jews in the United States were to decline significantly, we could expect to see an increase in Aliyah, because there's always a push as well as a pull, and in that case the push would be stronger. So let's wait and see what happens. I'm not predicting this. I don't know what's going to be, but there's always this correlation, and there always has been this correlation. Jews have always moved to Israel both because of a dream that pulls them and because of dissatisfaction with the state of Jewish life in the communities where they live. So the more that you all are happy here, the less chance there is of Aliyah from here. Anybody else in the room want to come up? Yes, please, Alexander.
Deborah, when you were speaking, I was smiling because I feel like I'm the anti-Deborah. So I grew up, I never went to Hebrew school, and didn't really belong to a synagogue, and I wasn't part of a youth group, and I was in a rural place on the West Coast, anyways. But my mother would always order Jewish music from New York, because that's where it came from in the 1970s. And so we'd listen to Jewish music all the time. And you know how the story is that the Swedish rock group ABBA never understood English? They were just sort of phonetically memorizing these syllables. Well, so I was singing these songs from the Israeli Hasidic Song Festival, and my brother and I would just, I would not want to replay for you what we thought was being sung, so what we were singing along with. But where this is going is that I sort of realized that not knowing Hebrew was an impediment to understanding lots of aspects of Jewish life. That may or may not have been totally correct, but it certainly helped to learn it. And so I did, and all that. But what I wanted to share was that when my family last went to Israel in 2012, we were in the homes of Israeli friends who were secular and who were West Bank settlers and who were religious Zionists living in Tel Aviv. And my daughter went to Israel for the second time when she was 13 on a Federation trip, where she commented afterwards. She said, you know, it's really interesting that you sent me to Israel knowing I'd be living in the homes of people you didn't know, and you were not worried about it, and I wasn't either. And I remember that when we visited my mother's cousin's family in Tel Aviv, it was on the 17th of Tammuz, and we had been doing an archaeological dig in the morning. We'd cleaned up, we'd put on skirts and nice shirts and so on, and they brought us out orangeade and cookies because they knew we were visitors from America who they'd never seen before. It was my grandmother's younger brother who'd made Aliyah and his descendants, but they wanted to be welcoming to the Americans whom they didn't know. So they brought out refreshments on a fast day, and my kids observed that in every place people wanted to make us feel at home, and they also observed that Hebrew, having some Hebrew, opened doors that they didn't even know were there. And I don't have any, obvious prescriptions for how to build relationships between the U.S. and Israel, but Israelis tend to speak English as well as Hebrew. We Americans don't tend to meet them halfway. In terms of having relationships with Israelis, my secular Jerusalem friends, I taught with Dorit for years at Hebrew Academy, and we shared an office and we were very close. My roommate from college, who I assure you was not religious in college, is the one who moved to the West Bank. And then my mom's family is my mom's family. I won't make Aliyah because what I do well, I can probably do better here in the US, and I have family whom I love and they're rooted here. But for my kids to know that there's this connection to Israelis and that we may not see them often, just like we don't see distant family in the USA as often as we would like, but we're there for each other. They'd bring out cookies and orangeade on a fast day just to make sure we were comfortable because they didn't know what to expect. And I can't easily say, go acquire Israeli friends. That's the way to do it. You know, you can't just decide who you're going to make your friends. But, and interestingly, Israelis in the USA often aren't hanging out in synagogues. I mean, some are, but a lot are not. But if we can find ways to build better connections with individuals, because we make connections with individuals, not country to country. And I think language is a piece of it. And trying to be in each other's homes and recognize that at some level we're family. Maybe we're not siblings, but we're cousins. Just random thoughts.
Yes, yeah. So two more, we'll call it a night. Everyone will get a cup of tea. Of course.
My story and my feelings are really quite different. Can you hear? Okay, my story and my feelings are quite different because I never heard the word Messiah used in any context except for Jesus until I was quite a bit older. But first of all, I'm a child of survivors. I think that's an important piece to know. I went to Israel in 1972 as part of my post-college, take your backpack and spend a year abroad. And I spent 3 months on kibbutz, which is a word nobody has mentioned, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to go to Israel. I grew up in a very liberal congregation in Manhattan, and I don't think I learned a whole lot of Torah, but I learned a whole lot of dancing that would be happening on the streets in Israel. I learned a whole lot about how the kibbutzim were founded, and I learned a whole lot about what life was supposed to be like on a kibbutz. The kibbutz I ended up on that first trip was a South American kibbutz with a cousin who was from Chile. And it wasn't quite that idealistic situation, but that was the idealistic dream that I had, that we would dance every night after dinner, everybody would be happy and everybody would share everything, and that didn't happen. I went back 3 years later, when I was doing graduate work in archaeology, and I worked for a couple of months on a dig outside of Lachish and lived on a kibbutz right outside there. And again thought, oh, this is going to be grand. Okay, I'm not going to be picking pears, which is what I did on the first kibbutz. But we lived the kibbutz life, only it wasn't the ideal that I had grown up with. And I was so disappointed that when there were a couple of minor things that happened, I just decided I don't really want to live here. And there was no religious context at all. It was my family's that is there is entirely secular. Whenever we've gone, it's been that experience. And with the exception, actually, of my very best friend from kindergarten who's become Haredi, and she and her family have just turned me off entirely to that particular piece of life in Israel. But it was that secular kibbutz, dancing in the evening after being out picking pears, that was my dream, and that didn't happen. So I did not make Aliyah. I'm here.
So I've been to Israel twice. First time I went on birthright, and it was a good trip, very educational, fun. Got to really experience and see a lot. Second time, I lived there for a year. And one of the memories I have, because I was living there, I had to go grocery shopping, and most of the food had Hebrew and English, because my Hebrew was passable, but certainly not good enough, except in the dairy section. So I'm standing in the dairy section, trying to figure out if the carton I'm holding is yogurt or cottage cheese or who knows what. And this older woman comes up to me, and she's very happy to practice her English and super welcoming, and wants, like, can I help you? And I'm like, oh, good. What is this? And she, instead of answering, said to me, are you going to make Aliyah? And I said, no, I'm here studying. And she said, oh, that's nice. And I could see the shutters come down, and she walked away. Didn't answer my question. That was it. And that was kind of the social aspects of, I was there taking. I was taking their education, I was taking an apartment, I was taking food. I was not giving. So when I was there as a tourist on Birthright, I was giving. I was giving money, I was giving my time, I was giving education. Maybe I'd make Aliyah by what I was giving. When I was there for a year, I was taking. And there was also this feeling of, even if I was making Aliyah, I would still be second, because I wasn't born there. I didn't grow up, I didn't experience all the hardships that a child would experience from birth all the way through. I would enter it later. So I would be second, and it would only be my children who would be true Israelis. And so when I came back to the States, I was very happy to come back. It wasn't a social kind of experience. I would love to go back there again as a tourist, but I have no further interest in living there.
Well, the last few comments are a perfect segue, starting with Alexandra's, into tomorrow's discussion, because what we've got to figure out tomorrow is whether and how we can build this relationship, which is so difficult. And all three of these comments have shown why it's so difficult, and we're going to talk about all of them tomorrow. I also had no romance for the kibbutz. I was never interested in kibbutz, and when I went to Israel, of course, I spent a lot of time staying on kibbutzim and have zero attraction to kibbutzim. The food in the Chadar Ochel never attracted me. I was really happy when kibbutzim started having takeout meals, which you ate at home. That was much more to my liking. I'm all in favor of community, but not that much. So that particular dream, and of course it turned out to be true for most Israelis as well. I'm glad we can admit that they're negatives, and I think in terms of what you just said, that I've experienced the same curtain going down. I find that some Israelis believe that, oh, you've made your bet, you've decided not to share our fate. There's now a divide between those who share our fate and those who don't. I remember I felt this even with my cousin, to whom I'm very close, that there was one of the recent wars in Gaza, and I called my cousin Aviva, and I got her in the car, and she was driving her son to the war. So my son was in college, and her son was going to fight the war. And there are some Israelis who can forgive us for that, and there are some Israelis who can't. And it's rarely spoken about, but that's another source of the tension between us that's not going to go away. I just want to say one final word in relation to what the rabbi said, and then we'll call it an evening. I think the 2,000 years that Jews have spent in diaspora is an enormously strong bond that you can't easily overcome. And that's why Ben Gurion, and not just Ben Gurion, because we have these dialogues that he had with leading intellectuals, they declared the Galut over. It's done. You are done. You have no future. Because they had to believe that there's no future. There's a saying in Hebrew, which I debated once, a leading Israeli literary scholar. He wrote a book called Ein Makom Acher. There's no other place. Because if he believed that there really is another place for Jewish life to be lived, that would threaten his notion of the reason for the state of Israel. So for him and some other Zionists, it was crucial to believe that there's no alternative, which is why Ben-Gurion, when he controlled the curriculum in the school system, would not let the history of the diaspora be taught. Because he didn't want Israelis to believe that they had a choice. But now every Israeli knows that they have a choice. And it's a much healthier situation. Every Jew in America knows that you can go and live there if you want, or you can go and visit there if you want, and it doesn't cost all that much. It's expensive, but it doesn't cost a fortune. And every Israeli knows that they can live elsewhere if they want. And a lot of Israelis are working for American companies and living in Herzliya, which is a good bargain that solved the economic pyramid problem that Zionists worried about for a very long time. They knew that most Jews are not going to be factory workers and farmers. And there would be a waste of Jewish brain power to have a vast majority of Jews growing bananas and working on assembly lines. And only when high tech came along did there come to be a feasible solution for Israelis to export and for Israelis to live in Herzliya and work for companies in Silicon Valley. And that, Shimon Peres dreamed about this before it happened, that has saved the state of Israel. High tech has saved the economy of Israel. And if you're an Israeli who's a believer in the project, you say, every time we need a solution like that to come along, it's going to come along because we're here forever. This has been great. You all are terrific. This was a great discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you again for another wonderful discussion. Again, tomorrow morning, the final lecture is going to be at 10:30. The title is Imagining a Way Forward. So it's going to be optimistic, I'm sure. So please, everyone, join us for that. As a reminder, for those picking up to-go meals tomorrow morning, between 9:30 and 10:30 is when you should pick up your to-go meals. Right now, for those at home, thank you for joining us. You are welcome to go get a cup of tea and a cookie. We get catering here, so please, everyone here, we'll go to the Handelman room. We have COVID requirements, so again, you can only remove your mask when you're sitting down eating. However, you're allowed to talk over to another table, so we can have a larger discussion should that be needed. Okay, so everyone enjoy, thank you, have a wonderful evening.